Morning, everyone,
Good morning.
and welcome everyone also on the Zoom virtual meeting. I will be the moderator for the event today, just giving some basics about how we interact with one another here. So if you have a question, raise hand, and I will ask, or you can directly ask the question, or depending on how the sound comes through the Zoom, or if you are here, just ask the question. And we use civil language, and we do not try to, we do not like anyone personally offending or using languages that will hurt people. And this is a forum that we welcome dialogue, people from all backgrounds. So feel free to ask your questions, and we will follow up after the talk. There will be a Q&A time. Thank you. And I will welcome Dr. Stephen Garber to speak among us today.
I think I'm going to have to get the computer signed on again. I was just instructed, so. Half an hour ago, told these good people, you know, when the technology works well, it works wonderfully well, and then when it doesn't, it just doesn't. So, it's just going to work here. We were already signed on a few minutes ago, and now we're not. We already had this all done.
Just share your screen, you good to go.
Ah, almost seamless. Almost seamless. Well, Pastor, thank you very much for the introduction. I heard out in the foyer that you're the pastor of the Soundtown Church, isn't it? New Song? Well, I was thinking back to, geez, 30 years ago or 35 years ago or something, bringing my wife and our 5 kids up to benefit concerts for your church there, the New Song Church.
Oh, yeah.
There was a guy named James Ward. We liked a lot in our family, and he would do benefit concerts. So sometimes we would be in Sandtown, sometimes out in the church kind of north of the city a little bit. But we were pretty committed in some ways to the hope you had, that we never lived in Baltimore and never really had a chance to spend more time with you. But I know about your church, and I always thought it was a great signpost of the way things ought to be. And clearly you picked that up in what you read from my book about seek the flourish of the city, and always have seen the hope you guys had for planting yourselves in the middle of that neighborhood in this city, and thinking I believed in you, so.
It was good legacy. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm in the church.
Yeah. Well, good morning to you all here. And some of you, a couple of you I know more about, and then others I don't know at all really, but this guy over here was a student with me at Regent College for a while, and then COVID began to plague the world. We both came home. So he came to Baltimore, me to Washington, DC, and so there we are. Well, the seamless life on the integral relationship of faith to vocation to culture. When I was moving from being a boy to being an older boy on my way to becoming a younger man, of course, when I was 10, I didn't think much about girls at all. Just was the way I was. I was sort of like, I had friends and maybe a little bit, but they were girls and I was a boy. I got to be about 13 and 14 and then began to think differently about girls and began to wonder more about them and be intrigued by them, interested in some of them more than others actually. And over the next, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years of my life, I would say I sort of swept my way into adolescent, affections and longings and, misguided loves, I'm sure of them. When I was 17 and 18, I heard the word worldview for the first time though. And I was intrigued by this idea of a way of seeing the world that was comprehensive and coherent. And I remember thinking though, at about age 18, that if this was going to be true for me, this idea of a worldview, I'd have to rethink girls, first of all. Because of course they were the very center of my little cosmos. And before I got to politics and economics and the arts and the rest of the universe, I'd have to rethink what I thought about girls was my heart at that point in my life. And I began to actually just begin to wonder if all the things I'd learned as an adolescent in America, whether they were really true or not, and how could they really be true. And I began to rethink things actually, because if it was going to be a world view, I'd have to actually think more deeply and more thoroughly about the way I thought about girls actually. It couldn't be just that I was a Christian and they were a Christian and then we were just boys and girls after all. That's of course, romance is romance, and affection is affection, and love is love, and desire is desire. And then of course, you're a Christian too, somehow. And I began to kind of try to rethink the paradigm as a 17, 18, 19-year-old, younger person in the world. And I began to rethink, for example, why was it that I'd begun to assume that this was true? There were girlfriend girls and there were friend girls. And I remember thinking, now, I don't think I really want to think that way anymore, because it didn't seem fair to me to make that kind of distinction as an 18, 19-year-old young boy. Because you could always say about somebody, oh, don't be so stupid. She's just a friend after all. As if somehow, that would dismiss her and put her in a category that, of course, I wouldn't be interested in as a person, really, as a serious person in my life, because she was just a friend after all. Well, I began to kind of rethink everything in relation to how I thought about girls at that point, realizing that if this was going to be true, this idea of a worldview, it'd have to actually be true for what I thought about most of all in my life as a 18, 19-year-old boy. Before I got to questions of political responsibility and economic paradigms that shape the world and the arts that reflect who we are and who we want to be in the world and all the rest of things, I'd have to rethink girls. Because you see, what I was beginning to realize was that if this idea of a worldview was going to be true, it'd have to actually shape my way of life. If my beliefs about God, about the human condition, about all of history were true, I'd have to actually rethink what I thought about most of all, which in some ways mattered most to me as an 18, 19-year-old boy. Other things I could in some ways conceptually imagine caring about, but I didn't care about them in the same way I cared about girls when I was an 18-year-old boy, actually. Well, I went off to college and spent a couple of years, taking my courses and passing my exams. And I just came to this place in my life where I thought, I have questions about how all this works out in the world, but I don't think college is a very good place to get answers for them, actually. So I dropped out of school. And in some ways, in the early 1970s, still in the sort of the age of what I've called then the counterculture In some ways, maybe it was more acceptable to do that than people might think today. But I did drop out. When I grew up in California, I spent the next year living in a commune in the Bay Area of California, hitchhiking week by week between Palo Alto and Berkeley and back and forth and listening to the gurus of different worlds and worldviews week after week after week and thinking through, so, okay, I heard that from you and I hear this from you and I hear this lecture over here and I'm thinking about this and I'm listening to this and reading this and what am I going to do with my life though? And who am I going to be in this world actually? I worked on a magazine that year. I was the managing editor for a countercultural newspaper, which went all over the country at the time. And, and I didn't write anything. I laid it out, basically, sure it got to the printer and we distributed it. That was what I did for about a year of my life. The next year, I hitchhiked across America, got on a plane in New York City, my first time ever in New York City, called Icelandic Airlines, which was the cheapest airline at the time in the world. And I made my way to Europe. I went to a place called L'Abri. And L'Abri was a French word called the shelter, which was the definition really. And it was a place where there was no website, of course, at the time. There were no brochures at the time. It was simply the word on the street was, if you had an honest question and you wanted an honest answer, you'd get this at L'Abri. And I had some questions actually in my life at the time that were beginning to drive who I was as a 20-year-old kind of a guy. And I walked into this place and I began to listen and think and talk and listen and think and talk some more. And I began to realize that what was I was being invited into was a way of seeing the world, even through this lens of this little community of people called L'Abri. Some of you are from a theological and ecclesial tradition, which I was reading about here. And I realized, of course, that you represent some of this same tradition that Francis and Edith Schaeffer had at the time. They were Presbyterians from St. Louis. They went off to Europe after World War II to see what the status of ministry to kids was about in Europe at the time, and stayed there. Actually, it's an interesting story itself, and a lot of books written about it in the years. But I stepped into it too, and I would say I met people and ideas there that really shaped who I've been ever since then in my life, beginning to give me ways to see the world that I began to understand as more coherent and more comprehensive, to use those good words. And I was drawn by that, actually. I could say a lot more about all of that. We have 5 kids, as I said to you, and we used to come to Sandtown and other places in Baltimore to hope for and give to the work of the Sandtown New Song Church. But one of our children is a daughter named Eden. She lives in Charlottesville these days with her family. And when she was a 20-year-old, she too, had an adventure in the world and went off to Africa for a summer to near Mombasa and the land beyond Mombasa in Kenya. And he's working in a medical clinic for people in that part of the world. And for the first time, saw people dying. It was really hard for this, little girl who'd been raised in a family like we had tried to be, but just to watch people who were not well, suffering, diseased, and died. And she had planned a pretty interesting 6 months in her life, it seemed to me. She was going to do that for the summer, then go to Geneva, Switzerland to spend this next semester studying an international health and development program in Geneva, which she did. She was the only Christian in the program, as she described it. And we talked about things, and they worked and thought, and they worked and thought more, and exposed themselves in some ways. If the one experience in Mombasa and Kenya was more micro look, this was a more macro global look at these questions of health and development. One weekend, she told us later, he decided she would find out where this L'Abri place was in Switzerland, just go visit it, because she'd grown up hearing about it. Took a train and took the bus and went up to the mountains and found this little place and came back at the end of the weekend. She wrote to us and said, I think I want to drop out of school and I want to go back to this place called L'Abri. And she did, and she first did this and first did that and was a student for a while. Then she stayed around to help some longer period of time, and she stayed to work there for most of her 20s, actually. And when she was coming to the end of those years, my wife and I decided we'd go visit just to meet her friends, the people that she'd come to love, and we did that. And one day I wanted to, in the earlier days of the internet, wanted to connect to this internet Wi-Fi world. I asked how do you do that here? She said, well, you have to walk down to the little church just down the way there. You probably can find some chalet that has some open system that won't require a password, and you can get into it, you know. Okay, you know, and I did that, and I walked down to this building, and there was a little sign on the door, and it said, the cult is meeting down the mountain this week. Not in English, but in French. I don't speak French, but I could make sense of the words, thinking, the cult is meeting down the mountain. I thought, oh no, this used to be a French Protestant church. I'm thinking, what happened here, I wonder? And then all of a sudden I began to think, little knowledge I have about most things in the world, thinking, I know that the word cult is differently used in the Romance languages of Europe, in French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian. It isn't pejorative like it is in the West. In America, for example, that if you're part of a cult, well, what happened? Oh no! But a cult actually is people who gather together to confess we believe these things to be true. This is who we are as a community. This is our confession of faith. Doesn't matter whether you're Presbyterian or Catholic or whatever you are, it's really a bigger word than simply ecclesial and congregational in that sense. I thought, the church began to happen this week. Well, I found my Wi-Fi connection in the next few minutes on a little bench beside this building, and I began to wonder, so one of my favorite places on the internet is the online etymological dictionary. And so I thought, where does this word cult come from anyway? I saw that the oldest word was the word cultivate, actually. Cultivate. And given my theological imagination and training, I immediately went to Genesis chapters 1 and 2, thinking that's really the very first task given the human being on the face of the earth is to cultivate the created order, to step in to see, in fact, could you actually make a fire? Could you make a flute? Is that a possibility? Could you grow corn? Could you bake bread? Could you do those things? Could you make an iPhone someday? That first vocation given to human beings actually was to cultivate the cosmos, to see, in fact, what is possible to be done on the face of the earth. Well, then, as I'm looking around these words and where they came from, I realized that cultivate, of course, is rooted in a word called cult. What does that mean? Cult in that sense. Cult. And what is cult's relationship to culture? Because I was at that point directing the Washington Institute for Faith, Vocation, and Culture. And I was always thinking about this relationship between these ideas, these words, faith, vocation, and culture. And as I was sort of seeking my way through the online etymological universe, thinking, I wonder what the word cult and cultivate and culture mean in relationship to each other. And I began to think about that, friends. In many ways, I've been thinking about that ever since then, actually. About how these words actually shape each other, they push and shape each other, they define each other, they need each other. It isn't always sort of one line, one, two, three, this, and this, though I would say it is possible to make an argument that cultic commitments, let's just open the universe a little bit here. If we commit ourselves to the cult of Mao, as people did in China for quite a while in the 20th century, they called it the cult of Mao, actually. We believe in, Presbyterian, Reformed theology, or whether we are Catholics, in a setting like this at St. Mary's. The cultic beliefs, cultic commitments. We think these things are true. About what? About the universe, about all of reality, about who God is, and who we are, what history is about. That cultic commitments are deep, deep, deep within us. One of my own teachers even called them pre-theoretic commitments. Pre-theoretic commitments. Which means, of course, that before I in some ways begin to imagine and to talk out loud, deep within who I am and how I see the world are things I believe to be true. In fact, they shape what I see about the world. Actually. Francis Schaeffer, this person from the Labrie world, sometimes used the word presuppositions, calling them, I've presupposed, before I've even began to argue or to talk out loud or think or to live, these things I think are true about the world. Cult is that. Well, of course, cultic commitments shape what I do with myself in the world, don't they? They shape my life in the world, things I think are important to do in the world. We could use the word cultivate, of course, to get at that idea. But of course, we could also use the word vocation. Vocations grow out of beliefs about what matters and what doesn't matter, what's important and what's not important. And of course, over time, cultivate becomes culture, for blessing and for curse, all over the face of the earth. And of course, like that is true there, it's also true that our sense of beliefs about God, the human condition, about history, our faith, Catholic faith, Protestant faith, Orthodox faith, just to use three big categories. That shapes our sense of what matters and doesn't matter, what we think is important and not important about the world. And we give ourselves to that in the days of our lives. We could call that what vocation means, couldn't we? But you see, over time, played out in history, city like Baltimore, place like America, the West of the 21st century, cultures began to grow like that. They develop out of that dynamic interaction between cult and cultivate and culture, between faith and vocation and culture. Some years ago, I was asked to meet a man for lunch in Washington, D.C., and I'd heard him speak, and then I was asked, would you please have lunch with him? He asked some questions. So he was a man named Eliud Wabakula. At that point, he was the Archbishop of the Anglican province of Kenya, which in some ways is hard to get a hold of. And he said to me over lunch, he said, well, maybe there are 6 million, maybe 7 million Anglicans in Kenya. We're not quite sure exactly. That's a lot of people, though. That's more than Anglicans than there are in America and Canada combined. You begin to look at these numbers and you think, sheesh, this church in Africa is what? It's actually bigger than the Anglicans in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and there are more of them, and you're the Archbishop of this whole shebang, aren't you? So if you know the name of John Stott, early on in Eliud's life, he was picked out by Uncle John, as he liked to be known as, and given a scholarship, of the Langham Trust Scholarship, became a fellow at Toronto, Canada University, and spent the next years of his life studying theology, and got a PhD there, went back to Kenya to become, John Stott's vision was theologically mature, deepened, rigorously trained, thoughtful, carefully, worked out mind and heart people to go back and serve the church in their cultures all over the world. Eliud was one of the first of these people in history, and became a parish pastor for a while, became a bishop, over the course of time. 3 times we've asked to become the Archbishop and said, no, I don't want, no, that isn't really. And finally, he was willing to say, I will take up the vote to be the Archbishop of the province here. Some of you may know that in the ecclesial history of the last generation, there was a group called GAFCON that came out of the Anglican, unfolding of its history in the world. The Global Anglican Fellowship, that was the acronym for. He was actually the head of GAFCON for a number of years, which was in some ways really the most responsible Anglican leader in the whole world. But he and I were talking over lunch. He wanted to have a real American meal before we went back to Kenya. I said, like what? He said, well, like mashed potatoes and gravy. I said, okay, we can do that. Went to a diner, in Northern Virginia, and sat there together, and it was not a fancy pants place. There was no cloth napkins. It was just paper, of course. This was the diner, as it must be. And we were talking about his life, my life, things we both cared about. And I put on paper napkin the words faith, vocation, and culture. And immediately, Eliud said to me, "There's a disconnect, Steve, in Africa, and in my church in Kenya. We have millions of people who profess faith in Christ, but we have a disconnect. We've taught a faith that has nothing to say about vocation." And of course, then we have corrupt cultures. And he says, what are we going to do about this? Would you please help us with this? I've never forgotten those words, actually. And he and I have corresponded, and even the last couple of weeks have been in correspondence with each other. I think very highly of him. But just think about that image for a moment and his response to me. Because if I have called this on the integral relationship of faith, vocation to culture today, here's Eliud Wabakula, very holy man, very bright man, very responsible man, who says, well, seeing those 3 words on a paper napkin in a diner in Northern Virginia, I immediately think about me and my life and my work. What do I want to say to you? There's a disconnect. In the church, we've not connected those. We've not seen the integral relationship between them. We actually said, well, there's one, and then there's another, and another. So we've taught a Jesus who has nothing to say about the work of your lives. And of course, he says we have terribly, horribly corrupt cultures with millions and millions of Christians, in these cultures. That's a problem, isn't it, actually? It's really a problem. These last few weeks, I've been in Singapore. In fact, we just came back just a few days ago. Singapore is a fascinating place on the face of the earth, isn't it? You know, or you don't know, but it's a city-state, which means it's its own, polity, it's its own government. It's like Maryland or something like that, more than it is Baltimore. It's actually its own nation. It's a city-state, about 30 miles by 30 miles. It's on the very bottom part of what we call Malaysia today, the Malay Peninsula. And I've gotten to know people there over the years for lots of reasons. And a few years ago, a man who heads up a very fascinating, unusual graduate school in Singapore. It's called the Biblical Graduate School of Theology. So it's something in the same spirit as St. Mary's, but not quite either. Something in the spirit as, I'll just pick a place, Westminster Place in Philadelphia, or Trinity in Chicago, or Gordon Conwell in Boston, or kind of pick a place you might imagine, but it's not like that. It isn't like Regent College either, actually, in Vancouver. I would say it's really the only place I know of in the whole world. And I don't know everything in the world, but I know something more than others. It actually takes the work of people in the world seriously. So it exists, its raison d'etre, its reason for being is to offer theological education to people who work in the world. That's why it exists, actually. It is not a seminary in that sense. You don't go there to get an MDiv. Doesn't make it a better place. I would never use the language of better or worse in that sense. But it's a unique place because it actually says people who work in the world day by day, some of them really want to dig away more deeply at their own theological moorings, to dig away more carefully and thoroughly and radically and rootedly, in fact, what they believed about the most important things in the world. This place is like that. Pak Wa Lai is the principal there. He was a really good man, worked in the world himself for a while, went off to Regent College 25, 30 years ago for a couple of years, and then went to Durham in England for a PhD in historical theology. But he's now the principal of this school. He's now made the board, well, not made, he's now persuaded the board of the school to require that all professors at this place actually have some marketplace experience to be able to teach at the school. Which is a hard thing to come by, actually, isn't it? You can imagine having a PhD in systematic theology, but also working for what in the world too. And he's not a cheap man. He's not a simplistic man. He just said, I think that our theology has to somehow speak to people who actually work in the world. And I want our professors actually not just to have this as abstraction in their minds. I want them to be people who in some ways can model this in their lives. So he and I have gotten to know each other the last several years of life. And finally, about a year or two ago, I said, would you ever teach a class for me here? And it finally worked out that it would be this fall, and simply called The Seamless Life, or the book that I've written by that title, Seamless Life. The subtitle of the book is A Tapestry of Love and Learning, Worship and Work. And it's essays with photos. I've taken most of them in the book now. But it's really just looking at how the interrelationships of these four ideas, four realms of life, four parts of your life and mine, worship and work, love and learning, how they somehow overlap and are interwoven in a tapestry that is your life and my life. So the course was about that, and I spent part of it teaching from Zoom in my home in Fairfax, Virginia, which I didn't like at all, actually. It's very hard I can't see your face raised, even though you're on a Zoom screen, I think. But I can't see whether you're smiling or not, whether you're paying attention or not. I don't know that. I hope you are. But I said to the principal, I'll do that, but I have to be there for part of the time too. He said, okay. So I went there for the last 3 weeks and finished the course face to face, embodied, which is a better way to teach anyway. And I love the students a lot, actually. I love them very much. And we just talked and talked and thought and thought and worked at thinking through what does it mean to see the world more seamlessly, to understand my own place in the world as a more seamless life. Not born of the dualisms which plague the church all over the world, the disconnections that Elia Wabakuli identified for the church in Africa. Well, we teach a Jesus, nothing to say about your life in the world, though. And of course, our culture, well, I don't know. I don't know. But how could we actually think more coherently, more comprehensively, which were the gifts of Labrie to me many years ago, about everything in the universe? Not only in the sense making sense of the girls in my life, but beginning to make sense too of everything in my life, of the whole of life. when I was there, I was hosted by two organizations, two groups. One was this graduate school. The other was by something called the Far East Organization. And the Far East Organization is a business, and it's headquartered in Singapore. And I would say, from what I could understand, but I don't know exactly, it owns a lot of Singapore. This is a privately held, family-owned company. The man who's the owner is a man named Philip Boone, NG. And very wonderfully and graciously and generously, he said, "Why don't you stay in one of my hotels?" And so as I was watching him, having lunch with him one day, just talking, I said to him, I would really love just to hang out with you sometime, just to watch what you do day by day, Philip. Because you have an empire of responsibility here in the city. And it actually, his work extends to Hong Kong and Australia and New Zealand and all over Southeast Asia, actually. But it's businesses and it's developments and it's housing and it's hotels and a lot of things, restaurants and all in some ways, he would say explicitly, if he were with us today, he's a remarkably humble man, even though he's very, very serious about his work. There's a sort of surprising humility about him, which is lovely and wonderful and important. But he would say, well, I really want this to be like Bach, sola deo gloria. I want all the things we do within my company to be solely to the glory of God, to the glory of God alone, as Bach used to sign his work, SDG, sola deo gloria. Now, what I do in my work to reflect this, it's a hard thing to work that out, isn't it, really? Because when it's hard to do that in your life and my life, with one person to be responsible here. I stumble every day over that, actually. You've got 12,000 employees, spread out over vast miles. You think, so how are you going to bring any kind of coherence and comprehensiveness to this confession, to this, in some ways, this cultic commitment you have into the kind of the work you do in the world, which has some kind of subcultural consequence, actually, for the city of Singapore and beyond. I can only commend him. I said to him when I got home, Philip, I determined I'm going to pray for you every day now. Just pray for you to be a wise man and a good man. Have the ability to think these things through that are complicated and difficult. If I met him, I had two people in my class when I was there. One was a man named Wei Lung Go. He's about my age, but he's a physician. He won the Singaporean of the Year award a couple of years ago, I was told by somebody. For what? Well, for creating a medical clinic system in Singapore for migrant workers who come into the city day by day, week after week. Singapore is a fascinating city for lots and lots and lots of reasons, right? But there's a great need for it to have people who are willing to do smaller things, less visible things, sweep the suites, and clean the toilets, and make the beds, and and do the things of life that we depend upon, but we don't actually think much about most of the time. And so this new friend began to decided years ago to actually bring other physicians with him into creating a clinic system for the whole city and state that Singapore is. To do what? To simply make sure that everybody had access to honest health and efficient and skillful health care. He doesn't make the headlines of the paper every day, and he's not trying to do that. He's his own humble servant of God in the world. But I was intrigued by this, just watching him, listening to him, thinking, good for you, Ronnie, to work out, faith and vocation and culture in the unique way that you're doing that in Singapore. Another guy was in my class, was not my age, more like 30s or something like that. Shen Ton is his name. And both he and his wife were in my class, and he's a lawyer by training. As he's called his firm Kith and Kin, LTD, I guess it was maybe something like that. Kith and Kin. What's it about? He says, I want my law firm to be known as a place where people can see themselves as cared for because we see ourselves as responsible for them. That we are in relationship together, therefore we're responsible to each other. And I want them to see this as more than just a law firm, which offers the law. You can pay it for the high dollar that we require of you. We need to stay in business. We have to charge you for the work most of the time. But I want you to see, in fact, that we want to actually stand between the needs of the world and your life and with the work, what the law ought to mean and could mean in the world. And I want to be somebody like that, to create a new way to think about actually the law being a servant to people in the city of Singapore. I could go on and on, people, to tell you about people I now have come to know, who knows lives are twined together with mine and my own heart of hearts. But I want you to see that this idea of a seamless life does, people try to work it out of them. People are trying to do that. There, as they are here, of course. But these are the stories that are fresh in my heart in the last few weeks. The Micah Forum, this is, isn't it? The Micah Forum. It would be, seem to me, impossible to speak to you this morning without somehow remembering Micah chapter 6 from Saved. It's a longer paragraph. I'm only going to pick out a few of the words here. But what is it? What do I require of you? What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with the nature of God. I've given a lot of my own life and thinking to this little phrase, this little call from God. Years ago, in the earliest days of social media, we would somehow be asked to say political convictions. And people say, I'm this, I'm that. I decided I would just say, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. Would be my political convictions. Because in some ways, I didn't find myself having a final home, or even a first home, within this side of the partisan debate. I have long argued wherever I've been. I used to teach politics in Capitol Hill for a long time, which is why we moved to Washington many years ago. But then my political convictions were what? Well, they weren't this, they weren't that clearly. But I would say, well, I think the gospel of the kingdom cuts deeper than the partisan divide. So on some issues, you might think, well, you're so this, aren't you? Well, you must be that. I would say, no, actually, I don't see it that way. I don't see through the lens of either the left or the right politically, because my convictions are born of deeper convictions, differently rooted, differently founded, cultic commitments shape my sense of political vocation in the world. Is how I've long believed, actually. So these words are awfully important. So of course, given what the world is like, dear people, you can get all A's and still flunk life, can't you? It's possible to actually pass all the tests required of you. You can even do that at St. Mary's Seminary. I'm sure you could be the A student, and in some ways miss the whole point. Isn't that the story really of Luke chapter 10, the expert in the law? The expert in the law. Fascinating, that's where the whole story begins in Luke chapter 10. The expert in the law. What? He'd been listening to Jesus where? In the marketplace. I think there probably is some academic professional jealousy going in there. He was not quite happy that this person who has no pedigree, where'd you go to school, Jesus, anyway? Who are your professors anyway, Jesus? What have you read, Jesus? I think all that's there in the story. But the question comes out. It isn't that lovely sense, honest question, wanting honest answer. It's more like, well, what about this then? And who are you really? I mean, do you have any right to speak about this stuff anyway, out for all of us to hear? I don't think so, actually. I'll trip you up over this question, is the way it works. And I'm sure you've all been in places where you think, oh, come on. That doesn't really matter to you, does it, anyway? You're just playing a game with us because you wanted to somehow impress us with what you read and where you've been. That's where the story is. And clearly, it's a possibility to memorize every yod and yota, which is in the Hebrew language, jot and tittle, of the law. Expert in the law that you are. And miss the point of the law. That's the point of the story, isn't it? So you see, it's possible to be people who would say, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God, and not live that way, and not work that out in your life. And the question always is going to be, how does a worldview become a way of life? How do beliefs become behavior? Not only in a sense for my private life, but in some sense for my public life too. The things I do out in the world after all as well. Micah's word to his own generation, of course, is to every generation, backman across time and history, for all of us, and even the 21st century. One of my own teachers, it's been maybe for some of you, and clearly was for Eli Wapakula in Kenya, was this man named John Stott. And I could say thousands of things about him. When he died, I even was asked to write an obituary to remember him because I remembered him. But he wanted to be called Uncle John by those who knew him. which was his own tenderness and his own, on the groundedness. And the kind of person you pick up at the airport and, of course, he would carry his own suitcase. Why? Because he didn't want you to think that he was a bigger person than anybody else, actually. He wasn't there to be served by you. He came to serve, actually, the work of his life. But I can still hear in my ears this sort of ringing Oxbridgian, John Stott, Cambridge educated, London lived, this person saying in his own wonderful, BBC kind of best of English, language. Why would you blame the world for being the world? It says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Why would you blame the room for being dark? Why don't you ask, why wasn't the light turned on? Why would you blame the meat for rotting, he would say. Why wouldn't you ask, why wasn't it salted? Well, I've lived in Washington, D.C. for a long time now. And it's a hard place to live. Baltimore is too in its own way, but this capital city just down the highway from you, it's a hard place to live. It's a place, of course, known the whole world over as a place of glories and shames, both together, twined together in a miserable way, oftentimes, actually. The monumental architecture is glorious, of course. I love it like probably we all do in our own ways. But of course, it's a place where the sausage is being made all day long, every day. I've had reason to quote Lord Bismarck, the German chancellor from the mid-19th century, every week of my life for 35 years, asked in his own time about German politics. He said, well, if you want to respect sausage or law, you can't watch either being made. And I used to think that was, cynicism, and I kind of pushed back away from it. I think the longer I live and work in Washington, I think now there's a hard-won realism about that, actually. So if you're going to stay here, you're going to have to be able to somehow make sense of and live with the sausage being made. Because it's not going to be better than that in this broken world. It's now, but not yet. It will be a messy business, actually. A place where glory and shame somehow is all twined together, all mixed up together. But John Stott, I could still hear him say, as I've already noted for you, these words, why would you blame the world for being the world? And I think back to Eliot Wabukula's statement to me about the Kenyan church and Kenyan culture. We've disconnected. We've disconnected what? Faith from vocation to culture. There are a lot of people who confess Jesus as Jesus in their own personal savior kind of way in Washington, D.C. Some of them are, you look at the record of those who serve on the Capitol Hill, everyone's a Catholic, everyone's a Presbyterian, everyone's an Episcopal, everyone's a Baptist, everyone's a Methodist, If there are one or two or three or five, they'll say none. But everyone wants to somehow publicly, when the big book is published year by year, identify with a particular ecclesiological tradition. But you think, what happens in terms of the public life and the issues and the way it gets worked out, you think there's a profound disconnect, isn't there? There's one member of the Senate some years ago who, I had something to have some knowledge of, was in a weekly prayer group for senators, met every week, Thursday mornings, people both sides of the aisle. And they would pray for what? Well, for my daughter's test tomorrow. They pray for my sister's, broken leg, or they pray for this and for that, all things of great private aspiration and need in both of them. But the senator walked out of the room that one morning and said to the person who then told me, I just wish we could have prayed for my vote tomorrow, though, because that's a hard thing for me to work out. But you see, in the definition of piety, born of this particular ministry to senators on Capitol Hill, the piety wouldn't allow them to actually pray about what? About the work of my life. Faith having what? No relationship actually to my vocation. Jesus, yes. Jesus, yes, rather. I'm sorry to say the word that way. But having nothing to say about my vocation. And what? A corrupt culture, the Capitol Hill has turned out to be. I'm not a romantic about anything in the whole world, people. It's not. I don't expect anything to be romantic in that sense. But I do want faithful people. I do want faithfulness to be worked out. I want there to be something more coherent and comprehensive, something more seamless about the way we see ourselves in the world. Some years ago, working on this question of vocation as I have in my life, I one day just wrote something down, and it's actually in a book called Visions of Vocation, if you'd be interested. It's a definition. It was my best shot one day, and it isn't the last thing to be said or even the first thing to be said. It was my own best shot. But you can see I put the word vocation is a rich one, having to address the wholeness of life, the range of responsibilities, relationships, work, yes, but also families and neighbors, and citizenship locally and globally. All of this and more is seen as vocation, that to which I'm called as a human being, living my life before the face of God. Never the same word as occupation, this is calling is never the same word as career. Sometimes by grace, the words and the realities they represent overlap, even significantly. Sometimes in the incompleteness of life in the fallen world, there isn't much overlap at all. We could say a lot more about all that, of course, and if you want to press me, we can talk about that more in the question time. What is the business of business? I gave a public lecture when I was in Singapore a couple of weeks ago, and there were two people who responded to me from the marketplace, because the banks of the city and the government itself, but I was asked to address a question about the business of business. One of the hats that I wear, you identified me working for Murdoch Trust. I do that, but I also, work for the Mars Corporation, headquartered in McLean, Virginia, of all places. It's a nondescript building right in the downtown of McLean. You'd never know it was there though. This global headquarters for a very iconic brand. Why? Because there's no sign on the building at all. There's a little sign up by the front door that says Mars Incorporated, but there's no dancing M&M's put on top of the building. There's nothing on the side on the street. It just is a nondescript building like downtown in Virginia. The global headquarters for a $40 billion a year corporation. Family owned, 100 years later, still privately held. About 15 years ago, my pastor drew me into a conversation with somebody, and it unfolded over time, and he became an executive at the Mars Corporation and drew me into a breakfast one morning in that area. And it was with the chief economist for Mars, who was his colleague, and they were both executives in the company, and they had a question they wanted to talk about. And the question was, how much money should we make this year? Which was asked by one of the three Mars siblings who own the whole shebang, the whole company. 125,000 employees globally, about $40 billion a year. So take one or two off, I suppose, year after year, but it's a big deal in some ways. And the question by one of the owners was, how much money should we make this year? We spent the morning talking about that. That grew into a conversation we decided to call the economics of mutuality. That's side by side with a company called Elevation Burger, which was born of a guy from California, came to DC to try to find a job. After a few weeks, waitering in a restaurant, got a job, one of the Congress people writing letters. And one day he had a letter from somebody in the constituency saying, why would my kid still be sick after having antibiotics, to be used, and why was she still sick? And he began to do some reading, and one of his lines of answering the question came to be that so much antibiotic use in meat is available to be eaten today, that in fact, we would get antibiotics into that way. And when you needed the antibiotics to actually work, they didn't quite work in the same way. He began to be interested in the question, and it's a complicated thing, like most things in life are, but he decided with his wife one day that we're going to try to make a restaurant to sell healthy hamburgers. They call it Elevation Burger, of all things. And he liked the music of U2. There was a song called Elevation Tour by U2 some years ago, and that's where the name comes from. But you can see that there's a tagline here, ingredients matter, on the cup there. And what he argued was actually that if I can find healthy cows to kill, if I can find actually a way to cook French fries, it's healthier than not by the kind of grease that McDonald's uses. But what about if we use olive oil, just as a simple change of thing? Because you see, olive oil works better with your body and my body. And you can tell I'm no longer this 17, 18-year-old wondering about girls. I'm not that age anymore. So I began to realize some years ago that if I didn't care about what I put in my stomach would push back and say, what did you put in your stomach today? I'd have to get Rolaids or something to kind of calm the uproar in my stomach. I began to notice that when I ate lunch with my friend Hans, there just wasn't any consequence. I could go back to work and not have to think about it, actually. I'm thinking, is it just like that, Hans? If I have a healthier, simple little meal, like healthier hamburgers and healthier fries, I can actually be healthier in the world, be like that, actually. Ingredients matter like that. I began to talk to my friend Hans, who actually was an honest lover of God, about what he was doing in his business. I begin to say to him, you know, Hans, you make eschatological hamburgers, don't you? Some of you can laugh at that because you know what the word is all about. I said, I can't promise you that in the new heavens and the new earth, your hamburgers and french fries are going to be there. I don't know. What I do know is that first thing we do together, when it's all said and done in history, you know, have a meal together, have a big dinner together, won't we? The long table called the marriage supper of the Lamb. The first thing that happens, what I understand, the long universal table, you know, that everybody on the face of the earth in history has ever been brought into the kingdom. To do what? Well, there won't be a table with apples on one end and donuts on the other. There'll be wonderfully imagined food the whole way down on it. And I don't know whether your hamburgers are going to be there, because I can't promise you that. But what I do know is that everything on the table will be healthy and tasty together. No trade-off on it. And so for you to do your darndest right now to actually make a healthy meal for us to eat, it's a signpost of the kingdom to come. It's the eschatological hamburger in that sense, isn't it? Well, the Mars project is a different project. It's called the Economics of Mutuality. Mars is a family-owned company. It is not a parochially born company. There is a particular faith, cultic commitment that I can identify and say, well, they're pretty good Baptists, you see, you know, pretty serious Catholics after all. It isn't like that, but there's an unusual conscience in the family over time, 100 years into the company's life, where they ask surprising questions like, how much money should we make this year? And over weeks and months, we decided to name the conversation the economics of mutuality. Wanted to argue that actually for a company like Mars, a family like Mars that owns the company, there are questions on how do we position ourselves in the market next year to be bought by somebody else without the highest price. Is that an evil thing to do? I wouldn't say that. But that isn't Mars's question. Their question is, how do we keep making money? How do we sustain profitability over time? How do we keep at this into the next generation? And we decided to argue, in fact, that to do that, you'd have to acknowledge a more complex bottom line than simply have you made the most money possible this quarter. That was a question to ask, of course. You have to make money to stay in business. But if that was the only question you asked, as Milton Friedman seemed to require of us, it wasn't a big enough question, actually. Other questions mattered. Like what? Well, what are the conditions in which our workers live and work and labor, have their lives? You know, when they grow cocoa beans in West Africa, you know, do we care? We can be actually interested in who they are. We created a research team very early on with Peter Burgers, that was named a sociologist, to go to West Africa, spend 2 years talking to people, doing interviews, evaluating what they learned really, and helping us think through, could we begin to offer as a different paradigm, a different way to think about making money in the world, more sustained profitability. I took these executives to meet Wendell Berry one day down his farm in Kentucky. Some of you may know his name, the writer of the essay, Ask the Farmer. At the end of the day, he said to us, you know, you want to make money for 1 year, you ask certain questions, don't you? But you want to make money for 100 years, you have to ask other questions. I would say the project we've taken on is a question for 100 years from now. How do we keep thinking this through, keep working at what? At this question of the business of business. Because you see in a place like Washington, D.C., probably Baltimore too, but in my city, you know, the throwaway line is, politics is just politics, get over it. Clearly, in the wider world, business is just business. I don't care whether you're a Catholic or Baptist or whatever, or Christian or not a Christian or whatever but business, you see, has its own rules, it has its own universe to live with that. And what we've asked is, could we rethink the paradigm? Could we rethink the paradigm? Early on in my own thinking about all these things, I began to come across the writing of a man named Abraham Kuyper. He was 100 years ago the prime minister of the Netherlands. Down at the university, he was a journalist for a time, theologian, a major book on the Holy Spirit, actually. But he became prime minister in the early part of the 20th century. He's most famous for these words: there is a square inch of the whole of reality, of which Jesus, who alone is Lord, does not declare mine. I would say those have been fighting words for me for most of my life. They've been shaping words for me for most of my life. I think that way. I want to live that way. I want to work that way. And wherever I go, even this course in Singapore, you know, this last few weeks, what do they read? Well, they read St. Augustine. They read Alexander Schneemann, Russian Orthodox theologian, but they also read the Dutch Calvinist theologian Abraham Kuyper too, and other ones as well. But those were three that I offered them to be reading for the text in the class. Why? Because I want them to begin to find their way in, whether it's through the Russian Orthodox lens of Schneemann or the Dutch Calvinist lens of Kuyper, to begin to see what a more comprehensive and coherent view of life in the world. If Kuyper says every square inch of the whole of reality, well, Schneemann, of course, argues that everything in life is sacramental. Everything in life is sacramental. The first chapter of this book is about what? About eating, of all things. This most ordinary thing all of us do on the face of the earth every day. We eat. Schneemann's book for the life of the world begins what? We're there in what we eat and why we eat what we eat. I wanted my students to have to wrestle with, again, these two big words in my life, threaded through the whole of my life now. Comprehensive and coherent, even from different theological ecclesial traditions, to see that, in fact, this, in Lewis's good language, is mere Christianity. But the church teaches at its best and truest over time. Well, I wanted my people to begin to think about that. And you can see that there's a continuity here between me now and me when I was 17, 18 years old. Because if I begin to hear the word worldview, at that point thinking, I like the idea, but I didn't know what it would mean. And realizing sometime the next days and weeks of my life, if it means anything, Steve, to be honest, it has to actually mean something for the girls of your life, doesn't it? And I realized that if I was, before I got to economics, politics, and the arts, I have to actually take this new worldview and ask it to rethink how I thought girls were to be in my life. There's continuity here. I remember when I was at Regent, a few years ago, getting the box one summer on my desk. I walked into the desk one morning and big box. I thought, I don't know the address. Who is this anyway? I just left it there for probably about a month. I thought, what is this? I didn't order it with anybody. I opened it up and it was a huge, big, thick book, Abraham Kuyper's writings. On what? On politics, economics, and the arts. And I thought, I didn't order that. I picked it out of the box and looked at it, turned it over. I thought, I wrote an endorsement for it. Which is why I was sent to it out of the blue, really, some time later. And I thought how funny it was for me in its own kind of silly, but interesting autobiographical way, that for me there was a certain continuity. That going back to this first belief, first cultic commitment about everything mattering to God, even the girls of my life. Before I got to these bigger questions of politics and economics and the arts, and to realize that somehow, in the strange grace of God, I had weighed in on these other questions too. But it was born, you see, out of this first commitment to rethinking what was closest and most intimate to me, mattering most to me as a 17, 18-year-old kind of a guy. Some years ago, I was asked by a prison fellowship, which is headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area, to speak to the staff one morning. And the question was, is it possible to have a contemplative life and still live in Washington, D.C.? That's a big question, isn't it? If you think about it. Busy place. If you come to the city, which all of you have, there are two lanes on the escalators going in and out of the metro system. Metro system escalators are what? Well, on the left side, people actually are saving the world in 5 minutes. Get out of the way. And on the right side, people come from Topeka, and they just don't know any better, and they just not quite sure where to be on the escalator. They just, you stay over there, because I need to get to the meeting, because I'm 26 years old, and if I'm not there, the whole universe is going to shatter. Washington, D.C. is that city, of course, the blessing of the curse. So how do you have a contemplative life in a busy place like that? Is it possible? I brought with me to that morning with the staff of Prison Fellowship, Abraham Kuyper. And I had 2 books, 2 first editions in US translations. 2 books he wrote, one about this comprehensive, coherent view of life in the world, one of a lecture he gave at Princeton Seminary 100 years ago. And there was an unusual book that most people don't know about called To Be Near Unto God. It's 110 meditations on one phrase from Psalm 73. After this long psalm of terror and tumult and kind of burden and, oh, God in heaven, it's a bad world to live in, isn't it, really? But the last words of the whole psalm are, and yet, it is good to be near unto the Lord. Well, Kuyper took those few words and 110 times wrote essays about them, meditations on them, while he was the prime minister of a modern nation state. No ghostwriters, nobody kind of a stable of people, think about this for me. Let me see it in 6 months or so. He actually wrote these himself, interestingly, in a strange way for us today. It's Dutch Calvinist Lectio Divina, to put it in other terms, actually, if you can imagine that. If I was going to be pushed to a desert island, I've often thought I would make sure I grabbed my Divina to God volume off of my shelf and said, I'm taking this one with me, actually. Why? Because you see, it's not piety for people who live in, ivory towers. I don't mind, in principle, desert fathers and mothers. I read them too. But most of us can't do it that way. We live in the world. We live in the cities. We have responsibilities in the world. We have to work out our faith in life with them. So I've loved Kuyper's meditative writing because there's a sense of reality about it. He's not writing about, the issues of, money in marketplaces and early 20th century Netherlands. Though we did think about those things. But there was no disconnect for him between his meditative reflections and you see his work as the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. It was as if they were different things. In some ways, I was just saying to the prison fellowship staff, you see, it's possible to have a contemplative life and still live in the moment. I think that's true. I have given you as a way into this morning, the integral relationship of faith to vocation to culture. Integral is an interesting word, isn't it? You could walk around, what do you think it all means, Johnny? I noticed as I was thinking about all this the last few days, thinking, well, okay, what's integral to Baltimore, to Maryland? Integral means what? Woven into the very life of. You can't think about Baltimore without thinking about this, because you see, it's one and the same thing. The Chesapeake Bay, pretty integral, isn't it? To the life of Baltimore Catholic person. How about crabs? Can you imagine really a life being a true blue Baltimore person without loving newspaper print on a wooden table and your own wooden mallet and cracking the crabs open thinking, they don't know about this in Colorado, do they? But we do. We live in Baltimore. Queen Mary. Queen Mary. In the days when, of course, there was a lot of turmoil in the church and the world over what we were going to be and who was going to be what, and whether England would be Catholic and Protestant, and back and forth and reign by reign and changing and changing and changing. For a little brief moment in time, Queen Mary was the queen of the day. When all this got started 300 years ago or so, what they do? They called it Maryland, after Queen Mary. This is of a different Mary, of course, St. Mary's Seminary, but you get the point, really, that in some ways there are names and identities. There's names like H.L. Mencken, the journalist of the early 20th century. If you study politics, history, and culture, you can't think about those questions without thinking what Mencken saw in the early 20th century. He wrote, we argued with him, what he discussed, and what he debated. You can't think about this city without thinking about Johnny Unitas and Lenny Moore, can you? They are iconic names, aren't they? They are the names of the city of Baltimore. You can't think about this without thinking about Frank Robinson and Brooks Robinson. They are integral to what it means to be somebody who understands what Baltimore means, aren't they? You can't think about Baltimore without thinking about Ann Tyler, the novelist, who cannot not write without thinking one more time about Baltimore. Her life, she lives and moves, has her being where? In Baltimore. And everyone who reads her and reads her again, it's one more story. What? About what? About Baltimore. You can't think about Baltimore without thinking about The Liar again. Because you see, it's a story set in the city of Baltimore. People the world over have lived in some ways with you on the streets of the city. Doing what? Going through the labors of love and trying to not become overwhelmed by the brokenness and hurt of the city. Listening one more day into the work of integral is that word, dear people. You see, you can't think about something without thinking about this. So I've said that today will be about what? The integral relationship of faith to vocation to culture. It cannot be for us that we suffer with the concern, the criticism, open-hearted, candid admission. We've disconnected this in the church in Kenya and throughout Africa. What? Faith from vocation to culture. There has to be something more integral, actually. I have for many, many years seen this as the credo of my own life, that vocation is integral, not incidental to the mission of God, to the missio Dei. Vocation is integral, not incidental. What do I mean by that? I don't know how it actually is, but literally, I'm just guessing if you were to walk into the churches of Baltimore tomorrow morning, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, whatever they might be, small ones, big ones, and you came to whatever would be called the congregational prayer or pastoral prayer, I wonder who would be prayed for? Would the street sweepers be prayed for tomorrow morning? With the waiters, the waitresses, with the restaurant owners, with the lawyers, with the kindergarten teachers, with the crabmen from the bay, be prayed for tomorrow morning. Who gets prayed for in the church week after week? We don't typically think people who work in the rural ought to be prayed for. Who gets prayed for? Well, people who do holier things, don't they? People who plant churches, translate Bibles, and who do this and that, and pastors and bishops, archbishops, and they get prayed for. Why? Because they do things that somebody God cares about. That's how we understand it in the church typically. I would simply say, if we could just simply change that one thing in the church tomorrow, we begin to change the paradigm. We're going to move away from the disconnection that Bishop L.U. Wakula could see in his own church. We're going to think, no, you see, there's a more integral relationship between this and this and this. It's a good word, dear people. It's actually a very good word. Well, a last note for you, a last note. A seamless life, it's a good word, I think. It's a good word. Because you see, it assumes coherence. It assumes a comprehensiveness. We'll begin to think, no, I'm actually going to look to see more seamlessly. That was the problem with the expert of the law, wasn't it? Wasn't he didn't know the law, but he didn't do the law. He missed the point of the law. He memorized the letter of the law, but he missed the spirit of the law completely. That's the point of the story of the Good Samaritan, isn't it? But Nicodemus, who was the teacher of the law in John chapter 3. Quite interesting language, the teacher of the law. He's the teacher of the teachers of the law. Comes at what and says, well, I'm hearing you, I'm listening, but I don't know what it means really. What does this mean? Jesus says, how could you be the teacher of the law, not know what it means? Finally, after we move through the more familiar verses of John 3:16 and more in that chapter, we get to where the conversation finally ends. And it ends here, actually, not with John 3:16. It ends with Jesus saying to Nicodemus, the reason you don't understand Nicodemus is that you don't do the law. You don't work it out in your life. You don't practice it. That's why you don't understand it, actually. Because you see, there's something actually in the reality of life, in your life and my life, and the way mind and heart is put together in you and in me, that actually requires us to try to connect what we think with what we do, what we believe with how we behave, our worldview with our way of life. My grandfather bought and sold cattle in Colorado in my life as a boy, and I loved his world very, very much. I spent most of my summers with my grandparents. One day, a Navajo Indian came to his ranch and wanted a cow. I wasn't part of it, I was a 5-year-old boy, but I heard the story later of my grandfather saying, well, and they bartered, and they decided to trade the Navajo Indian blanket for a cow. My grandfather used it for a saddle blanket for many, many years. When he died finally, I was the one given the grace, I suppose, of having this blanket. It's just outside my office door, my study in my these days. My grandfather's branding iron, a rope, a lariat, all together in one place. My grandfather, night by night, as I was a boy, would lead us on his knees with my grandmother beside him, on their knees, praying for all kinds of things. Really. Some of the words were the same words night by night, and in fact, I could even pray them right for you right now because they're still imprinted on who I am. The words my grandfather prayed night by night. But I also know that when he went off to buy cattle the next day, that when the auctioneer was wanting to sell a particular kind of cattle, sometimes my grandfather, who was one of the buyers, he would stop his auctioneer's call, blah, 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 and he said, Mr. Gilchrist, what are these cattle selling for this week in Colorado? And why did he ask my grandfather? Because he knew he would know. Of all the buyers, my grandfather would know the price. So to be honest about the price too. My grandfather was a math wizard, really. He just confused my math. He could have just quickly changed it for his own advantage. But he knew that The opportunity that my grandfather would tell him the truth about the price that week. Even if my grandfather was there to buy cattle as well. When I began to think these things through more as I moved beyond being a 5-year-old and a 12-year-old, and, you know, now much older than all that, I began to realize that my grandfather, who never read Saint Benedict in his life, I'm sure, who called a community into being in 5th century Italy, is that we will be born by our common commitment, our cultic commitment to what? A life of ora e labora. We're going to gather together, watching Rome fall apart and disintegrate as a civilization. But come with me, we're going to work out a life where praying and working are held together. It isn't that somehow those of you who are more pious will pray over in that corner, and those of you who just have to get things done, go over in that corner, you do the work of the Lord. But actually, we're going to create a life, a calling into being communally and corporately, where we are born by the commitment to praying and working together. A life of ora e labora. Well, brothers and sisters, the microphone that you are in the business today, I would simply say, yes, it's a seamless life we're talking about today. On the interrelationships, the integral relationship of what? Of faith to vocation to culture. Well, let's talk about it for a minute.
Why don't we take a short break? We sat for a long time. You want to take a bathroom break or some water?